Accessing higher education and languages. Now, what happens when these students from these two different school systems move into higher education? And now we look at the experiences of the siblings who are in higher education. So, when once they move into higher education, this is not a problem for the private school students, but it becomes a lot of problem for those coming from the government schools, because in higher education, although there are options for some subjects to be taught in Urdu, yet all the science related or the key subjects are in English language. So here comes the problem when there is this huge divide and there is a student, and not only this one, but across all the interviewed government school students who were in higher education, they talked about this immense struggle. This struggle and this challenge of not being able to understand anything. So could understand nothing at all. This is a quote from the student who was in higher education, and this was followed by his own way of dealing with it. And he described how he took a dictionary and he would do a word by word translation of each word to understand the textbook, since he was in FSC. Now, these students we are talking about were in science groups, because others who were not aspiring for these careers, they could take up subjects that were being offered, at least in these early stage where they were. Later on, of course, the subjects become lesser and lesser, which are offered in Urdu, until English takes over the whole thing. Now, when the rules of the game changed, that is, when the language of instruction changed from English to Urdu, from Urdu to English, then it was not a problem for the private school students, because it was just a continuation of what or how they had been taught in the school system. But for the government school students, it was a huge leap. And this also changed the positioning of the government school students. So bright students, for instance, Hasnat, I'm taking pseudonames over here. So students like Hasnat or Farhan, for instance, who were gold medalists in their schools, when they entered the higher education, they were lost. And they suddenly realized that they were so much less better. They were so much less better than the private school students, who seemed to go through their text so easily, skim through it, understand it, while they were constantly struggling to understand the concepts. And this problem was a major one in the science subjects, because there was a problem of conceptualizing the whole thing. The problem also arose because what they wanted to do was they wanted to to connect the subject matter with whatever they had already covered in their previous schools. Now, although there was a continuation and gradual complexity of the concepts that they had already covered in secondary schools, but because the terminology of those things that they had studied in secondary school was changed into this terminology of English, they had a huge problem in understanding that these two were the same concepts. Now, we looked at the textbooks, and we realized that in the textbooks, in their science textbooks, there were English words given for those Urdu words that were in the main text, and these English words were in brackets, but only one student from the government school actually said that these were referred to by the teacher, or the teacher drew the attention of the students that this is a terminology in English and this is how we are doing it now. Most of the students, actually all of them except one, did not know it. They had huge problem in connecting or conceptualizing these concepts, and they had problem in participating in discussions also. And Sameen explained that in her English language class of the first year, 60% of the students were from the government schools, and yet none of them could participate easily because they could not understand the English language lecture. And when they asked the teacher to explain it in Urdu a little bit, she just said, this is how it is going to be now because you are in higher education.